Ever noticed AI that works great in English, but not so much in the other languages? If you have felt that gap, you're not alone. And today we're diving into why multilingual AI still has a long way to go. Welcome to the Women in AI Research podcast, the show about remarkable contributions of female researchers around the globe. I'm your host, Jekaterina. Our guest today is Dr. En-Shiun Lee, and I'm really glad to have her on the show. En-Shiun is a key researcher in AI focused on a big question. How do we build language technology that speaks to everyone? She's an assistant professor at Ontario Tech University and holds a status-only appointment at the University of Toronto. She leads the Lee Language Lab, L Cubed, a research group dedicated to language diversity, multilingualism, and making tech more culturally inclusive. Her work impact is broad. She has published in top venues like Nature, ACL, Knuckle, Calling, and many others. But what makes Annie especially inspiring to me goes beyond her research achievements. I often see her at events with her baby, balancing the demands of motherhood and the academia so gracefully. That kind of strength and courage to balance her family life with a full research career deeply inspires me. Annie's excellence has been recognized in many ways. She was nominated for the Tim McTiernan Student Mentorship Award and for the Women in AI Researcher of the Year Award. And she won the ARIA Spotlight Award for her work with the MSCAC program at the University of Toronto. Today, in our conversation, Annie walks us through the heart of her work on multilingual and multicultural AI, from the widening language gap and the lack of benchmarks for underrepresented languages to why domain-specific data matters more than just scaling up models. And if you stay until the end, Annie shares a perspective that really stayed with me, how even tiny mistakes in AI outputs can quietly accumulate into systemic harm when billions of people rely on these systems. It's a powerful reminder of why multilingual and multicultural AI isn't just a research challenge, it's a responsibility. And now let's dive in. Annie, welcome to the Women in AI Research podcast.
Thank you for having me. I was so excited when I hear that you were starting this podcast, and it's very exciting to hear and highlight women and my fellow researchers in this area.
Excited to have you here as well. Let's start with your personal journey.
Mhm.
First of all, I wanted to ask you what brought you to the work on multilingual LLMs and what made you question like the topic of linguistic diversity in AI?
Yes. So when I was in computer science, I was one of the very few women in my class, and it was the same when I got into graduate school, and I've always really cared about inclusion and diversity, and including as many people as possible into a technology. And so, being a minority, a visible minority, and woman in computing, it was really a lived experience for me that sometimes people assume that you don't code as well, or sometimes people assume you're not as smart, and there is also the imposter syndrome. So when it comes to language, so I got into NLP after I finished my PhD. I really enjoy working on text and NLP, so after my PhD I got into text. And eventually I learned that there is this language gap, this widening language gap that is a barrier of access to lots of people around the world. I mean, you speak a different language, I speak a different language. Canada is made up of diverse immigrant populations of people who speak different languages. And you realize that if you don't speak English, there really is a barrier to access in language models and language technologies, and that really spoke to me as an experience coming from computer science. And I knew that I could contribute a lot, and it's a topic that I'm very passionate about, and the research is important and significant.
That's super important. I like how you combine that diversity of cultures, languages, gender diversity, and that all together motivates you. Uh, Amazing. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Uh, I'd also like to ask you this question, which is maybe slightly more personal. Hopefully, you feel confident answering that. Um, I know that many researchers in our space think that it is quite demanding to balance parenthood with academia, and
Mm.
it is both demanding, but at the same time, it may be very transformative. So I know that you have recently welcomed a baby, uh, and
Yes,
congratulations about that.
thank you.
Um, so I'd like to ask, has this life transition influenced how you think about your research or the impact that you hope to have?
Mm, yes. Um, yeah, so I think becoming more busy means that I get to focus um, I get to be more focused and being effective with my time. I get to focus on the initiatives that are the most important and spending time on things that I truly need to do. Um, and so I cannot, as my supervisor always used the word meander, so I cannot meander as much. I have to be laser focused on getting the things I want done. So that might mean that sometimes I cannot solve a problem for my students. They'll have to solve it for themselves, which is actually a good thing. Or, sometimes I might choose not to, submit a grant, which is not, as um, is not as a grant that might not fit my research as well. So it just means that my time is limited, and I have to let go a little bit more. I cannot do research the same way as I did during my graduate studies, where I read every single word, ran every single experiment. I have to trust my team to solve and work on the problem and not micromanage every single aspect. But I think that's definitely a paradigm shift to let go, because as PhD grads, as people who made it this far, we tend to know that we want to do as much as possible to drive the research and get it to the high quality as possible. And sometimes you want to do everything, but mm, I think also a part of becoming more senior and running a lab is also learning, how to build a team based on trust and, psychological safety, that everyone believes in each other and works really well with each other. Um, and so I think one of the things I learned was, is very it's very hard to go far on your own as a single person. But when you're on a team where everybody contributes a different perspective and a different skill set, you can go very, very far. And so that's the philosophy I take in my collaborations, widely with transdisciplinary teams with different people. And that's the sort of philosophy I bring to the students, especially undergrad students. We've been very successful at getting undergraduate students published together, because no, one person might be really good at writing and making arguments. One person might be very good at running experiments, and one person might be very good at doing the linguistics aspect. And so when we all work together as a team and push hard together, we can truly go much farther than alone. So, so yes, I learned to be more senior and how to build very strong academic and research teams. And then managing my time better. And so those are the two things.
Right, right. Uh, Very insightful. I especially like that part that was about going far with the team. Reminds me of that saying that alone you can go fast,
Mhm.
but with the team you go
Far.
further. Yeah,
Yeah.
you go far. And the other part about balancing, learning how to balance the time better and managing your time, it resonates with something that one of our previous guests in one of the previous episodes, Angelica Lim,
Mm,
she also talked about this in terms of in relation to partnerhood and the motherhood, and she called the tenure track system totally broken for
mm,
women.
mm,
Because it's essentially, as she said, asking people to push harder than
mm,
ever during the same years that
mm.
they might want to start a family.
A
So I
family.
wonder,
Yes.
do, do
Yeah,
does your
that's true.
experience align with that?
Yes, I think it's absolutely true. I yes, it's definitely an unfair yes. So it's definitely true that, if you go through the PhD process, the tenure track years or maybe the PhD years are those years that women have to start thinking about having children and having babies. So I think the pro tip, like the secret is that you need to find an institution and um, seniors, like bosses, who are truly supportive of your journey. It's very hard. Like they talk about, finding supporters versus, advocates. It's really truly finding someone who is going to help protect your career while you're on leave, and also finding an institution that accepts the fact that you might be on leave. And in Canada, that's 12 months to 18 months. And so, and so that is, it definitely, so before giving birth, I was very bewildered about potentially, stopping my research, stopping the train and getting off and not being able to do things and falling behind. And that was a fear. I think, I don't know if many other mothers feel this fear before they have their baby while on the academic track. But I think someone told me, the next train will come and you just get on it. And I think in some ways that's true, but I was very lucky with this baby, and I don't know if this is the right thing I should promote to everyone. I said that like for this baby, I didn't stop. Like I still brought the baby to all the Zoom meetings. Like post COVID, everything can be online, which is wonderful. So we still went to all the Zoom meetings. I couldn't micromanage things as much, right? Like I couldn't answer that reviewer rebuttal in the full extent I wanted. I really had to trust my collaborators, and my students all have co-supervisors and like senior mentors. I really had to trust the structure, the infrastructure and the processes that I built up. Like I really had to trust that they would just rely on someone else rather than just me, versus like me having to do everything. And I think like distributing that responsibility, that mentorship and workload was also helpful. Yeah, it's definitely and I just want to encourage everyone that, it's okay to bring your baby to things. It might be scary at first in like a male dominant industry, but it's okay and you should do it. So this baby, I started bringing this baby out at I think 3 months. First on short trips to the
Oh,
university. Yes, yes. So first we went to like, Ontario Tech, we went to Waterloo, we went to downtown Toronto, we went to Vector, like close by. And then we built that up to going, I guess a little bit farther. So I took him um at 7, 8 months to a conference in Taiwan, like international linguist. So I took him to International Linguistics Olympia on my own for 7 days. It was very hard. but it's sort of like the PhD. You survive and you realize you are stronger by the end of it. And then we went to Column, Conference of Language Model in Montreal on our own. And then we just came back from a CFAR symposium in Banff. And IOL, I had to bring him to all the events. Column had funded childcare, which was really fantastic. Um, and CFAR also had funded childcare. So it's finding these conferences and organizations that has built-in structures that encourage parents.
Mhm.
That's very important. Um, and also being brave. Yeah, so I brought the baby out to University of Toronto for a panel and for women, a mentoring panel for women. And I just wore the baby, and the baby slept through the entire the the most of the panelist session. And I saw that people that I look up to, like they would bring the baby to the lab, they will keep going with the research. And so I saw that as yeah, for my mentors, and so I chose to do that as well. So yes, it
Nice.
is definitely, I think it is definitely hard to have the best part of your tenure track process sort of feel like it's slowed down by a baby. But um, at the same time, is still very encouraging that there's these systems in place that you can take advantage, like you can make use of and come bring the baby. Yeah, so I
Right.
would definitely encourage, like, you don't have to slow down. It might feel hard, it might feel overwhelming, but you can do it. And I just want to say that now in Canada, the answer grants, depending on what kind of things, you can you can add the time back and you can pause your tenure clock. So I think tenure clock is pause like 101. Like if you take 1 year off, you pause 1 year. But in some things like calculating early career chairs with the length of consideration for your NSERC, or even for COVID, in some places you just add the time back. Some places you can add double time, and some places you can add 1.5 time.
Mhm.
So just make sure you do that. And it's not
That
like I stopped my research. I just distributed my research so that my students have so my collaborators are still publishing and I'm still involved.
Right. Thanks for opening up about this very personal experience. It was really interesting to hear about, and it also sounds like the system is changing, like maybe slower than we would wish to, but it's changing. So conferences are accepting people with the kids, with the babies, and
I would say it is it is in the minority, so you have to find it. So yes,
Mhm.
system is changing and you should find the ones that are more modern. Which
Right,
is why, you have to find,
the right place.
superiors, you need to find jobs and institutions, you need to find conferences, you need to find grants that have this perspective of working mothers, and adding the tenure pause and being very accepting of that. So I think I would just say that it sounds encouraging, but also be careful, right? Like you don't want to get stuck in like an like a old boys club, and then being in a unfortunate situation. Like you have to find colleagues who are supportive and institutions and conferences that are open to that kind of things.
That makes sense. That's fair enough.
Yeah, you have to
Uh,
find your community.
yeah, as usual, you need to find your people. That's true. Okay. Uh, and now let's dive into your research.
Oh,
You're doing research on language diversity and multilingual AI. So,
mhm.
what do you see as the biggest challenge in evaluating multilingual language models today?
Yeah, so there are quite a few. There are a few multilingual language models out there. I think, they're slowly adding different languages. They're trying to cover 200 to 500 languages. and they're doing it by curating and collecting data sets that are high quality from annotators and injecting them, like including them into the model, which is very encouraging to see. I think in terms of the evaluation, the most difficult part again is the very simple thing is like the lack of data benchmarks. So anytime a new language gets included, because it's a long tail problem, right? You have your popular languages that is profitable for large companies to cover. Then there's a long tail of thousands of languages, and then even longer tails of dialects without written text or variations of vernaculars. So it's a matter of like how much data there is, and every time a new data set or benchmark gets included, it definitely gains a lot more attention from researchers and users being able to use that benchmark data set. Yeah, so that is one thing. Another thing is that English is always going to be the focal point. Is it's and so I think most corporations and technology companies would focus on English first versus everything else, which makes sense. But also English must never perform worse when you are creating a model. So that is a essential criteria. So that is a English focus point when you're creating multilingual models. So then maybe this is an argument for creating regional models instead for regions that do not predominantly speak English, rather than just having a huge multilingual model. Um, most models think in English, so there's that issue. Another important thing that we wanted to sort of share with the community in our foundational paper on low resource language translation is, you know, the four important aspects to get across. So one is creating new data sets, and two is having these open toolkits and models. The world language database is very important for the community to share, but also having your parsers and taggers for your language, or even OCR to for your language. Community collaborations are very important, like Massacane, C-Crowd, America's NLI, and then regional opportunities in funding and grants to the regions for collecting data. That is also incredibly important.
Okay, yeah, and then building on that first point that you mentioned about the long tail of languages,
Hmm.
I, I know that you have that new paper on SIP 200 dataset.
Yes. Hmm.
And in that work, you provide a topic classification benchmark for over 200 languages and dialects. And for many of these languages, that was the first publicly available evaluation data set for
Yes.
natural language understanding, right?
Hmm.
So could you tell us a little bit about your motivation for this work and also how you approach creation of such a massive multilingual benchmark?
Right. Right. Yeah. So a lot of times when you're annotating from English, especially with translation. So this is so from SIP 200, what we did is we took the Flores data set, which is multi-way parallel translations of 200 plus two languages. The additional two is in Flores plus. Um, and so it's a multi-way parallel translations from English. So already you can see that like from a multilingual, multicultural perspective, everything is always rooted back in English. But anyway, back to this work. So in this work, what we did is we took those sentences and then we further classify those sentences to create a natural language understanding, like an entailment data set from English. And we can talk about the challenges of that's starting to come up with multilingual, multicultural work later. So that's what we did. Um, and from there, we were able to um, benchmark the data set on various models, and then explore the language families and the regional differences. And for sure, we start to see that even though it's the same data set for every language, it performed much worse for African languages, South American languages, and much better, of course, for English, European scripts, European languages. So we definitely saw that there were regional differences there for based on this benchmark data set.
Mhm. Yeah, it reminds me of one of our previous episodes as well, where Vered Schwartz was speaking about regional differences
Yes.
across AI systems, and she
Mm,
mentioned that like that geographical distance based metrics are well, not always correctly represent the diversity of languages because, let's say, US and Australia are very
mhm.
distant in terms of like actual physical distance, but the cultures
Yes.
are probably way closer to each other than, let's say,
Yeah.
US and
So
one of the African.
Yeah, so that's the exciting part. I actually wanted to talk about one of the work we did, which is the World Languages Database that we've been working on, I think, the past 2, 3 years. And this was a database built by CMU rather quickly. And then they published a paper, and now researchers, computer scientists who come from the language model world, who are not steeped in linguistics, they use the database assuming that is perfect and correct, and then that the language vector they used it as like a math vector, right? Like just added up with cosine similarity. So we did a reproducibility evaluation on the database, and we found that is the imputation method might not be right. There's missing data, there's missing languages, there's missing features. And so we actually went and we've submitted 2 papers and published one so far on how to make this database stronger. So now it's called a Uriel Plus, because the original database is called Uriel, and we made it into Uriel Plus. So we gave it different distance metrics that you can use, and geographical is one of them. But we recalculate the English distribution based on the number of speakers, and then we also calculate like the language families based on their hierarchical tree structure based on the genealogy of the language. And then we also did a third distance calculation, and then we added scripts, right? How script features how a language is written, and we added more languages. So we actually did a lot of work on this database the last couple of years. So hopefully everyone will use it, and it will help in a more transparent manner. And everyone will learn a little bit about linguistics before they
Mhm.
blindly try to use a linguistics database, or at least they have some understanding when they use this database, because there's now different options of using different distances, and now there's more features and different imputation methods for missing data.
Right. That's great to hear about that because it's not just about the new artifact, like the new data set, but it's also that you have introduced those additional new metrics, right? That
Yes.
everyone could use to evaluate their own, let's say, data set.
Yeah, it's I feel like we're doing important basic work on making this database better for the community to use, especially for people working on language diversity and multilinguality. I think a lot of people will come across this database, and maybe they want to choose a pivot language, and like this is the pivot language they should use. We also
Right.
so we did data. So we added more data. We improved the calculations of distances, and then we added a benchmark suite, so that for anyone who's adding on top of it, or for ourselves when we're making improvements, we can always go back and benchmark and know whether we're doing better or worse. So it's not like blindly creating a database. It's creating a database, then having a world languages database for the community to use, and then have some sort of a baseline saying this is how much we're doing better or worse, and is very transparent.
Right. That sounds like a super important and valuable new resource of information, metrics, and data. Amazing. And thanks for working on that. Um, I want to quickly come back to the SIP 200 work
Hmm.
and mention that you in that work you have found that simply scaling the number of languages in pre-training without scaling up the domains isn't that helpful. Can you elaborate a little bit on that point and
Right.
tell how it can help with building multilingual models?
Ah, right. So yeah, so before we started working on SIP 200, 500, sorry, SIP 200, we were doing some um similar to benchmarking, but we were looking at different factors that goes into training a model for different languages. And the central question, the research question we wanted to know is, okay, we have a model that we're going to train. What should we be spending our limited resource on? Right? Like every language would like to have a model for themselves, but should they be collecting unsupervised data for pre-training? Should they be collecting supervised data for labeling? Should they be collecting domain specific data? What should they be spending time on? So we came up with 5 different data dependent factors. So amount of pre-training data, amount of fine-tuning data, whether the data was noisy or clean, um, the domain similarity of the data, and then the language similarity. Maybe we can use, instead of English, we can use Spanish or French, or instead of Hindi, we can use something similar in the Indic family, maybe like Punjabi. So those were the research questions and the variables we looked at. So we did some preliminary experiments, holding some variables fixed and then varying the other ones. And then we did a mathematical analysis of which factors is most important. And it turns out pre-training doesn't get a little bit of data in pre. You really need a lot of data for pre-training to work, to build a model for that language. So nowadays you really have to settle on fine tuning, which is like taking that little bit of multilingual data and then fine tune the model on top of it. And you can use like different parameter efficient methods, adapters, QLoRa, to fine tune your model. And then another thing we found that was very critical was domain similarity. It was very, very important for the data that you are fine tuning is exactly in the domain that you're working on. That is something that is the most important, and you should spend the most time in collecting your data on. And then language, it didn't work for us just because of the reproducibility issues that I talked about in the World Languages database.
Hmm. Yeah, right. That's very interesting. Um, let's move to a different work that you have done on multilingual models,
Hmm.
which is called MR3.
Hmm.
And that's a multilingual version of R3,
Hmm.
a rubric agnostic reward reasoning model that in MR3 is trained on 72 languages, and it achieves the broadest language coverage in reward modeling to date. Can you give us a little bit of introduction on what's motivated this work and like the brief overview of what this work accomplishes?
Right. So I really have to give all the credit of this work to my collaborators, which is David Anugraha, who is currently a master's student at Stanford, and Jenta Winatra, who is working at Capital One in their research team. They're both prolific researchers doing a lot of exciting work in multilinguality, especially in the Southeast Asian crowd community. So it started off, I think the history and the story behind it is that David and Genta worked on a rubric agnostic um, metric for the WMT 2024 competition last year, and they quickly came in first place. And because all of us, we work on multilinguality, it's a topic that we are passionate about. One of the most important things for us to do next was to scale this metric up into multilinguality. So the idea is that we want to, find evaluations using LM judges. Um, and, these metrics and evaluations and LMs, they work well. As always, they work well for English. And that is true for all language technology and everything in research in general. But when you bring it to, other languages and then moving down to medium resource languages, low resource languages, they just do not generalize as well afterwards. And that was also true that when we were doing our translation work um, on multilingual translation, the traditional metrics like BLE didn't work well for non-English. So we had to move to piecewise BLE and character F plus, and just different metrics for a multilingual context. And that was something that one of the students worked on, was exploring all the different metrics and seeing which one actually um, worked realistically for the different languages that we were looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that work was with Shravan Nayak, who is now at Mila, and Sarangika, who was a professor in New Zealand, who was in Sri Lanka during the time we did the research. So I just want to make sure we credit everyone for their excellent work. Yeah, so for this metric system, we did notice that multilingual rework research is like very, very limited. There's really not a lot of available materials out there. So we introduced a massively multilingual rubric, like an agnostic reward model. So we trained on 72 languages, and part of it was also carefully selecting the data set and the curricular learning strategy so that it performs, state of the art reward for the benchmark. And we have another paper on data collection that is coming out at AACL that shows that, by carefully selecting the most relevant languages, it was the most related languages, it actually makes a huge difference in the performance. And we also have another paper that's submitted that's on curriculum learning. But anyway, there's a lot of ongoing work, but this particular one, we benchmarked it and it actually performs incredibly well. So it seems like what worked as like we came in, the David and Genta came in first place for the metric task at WMT last year, seems to also work for multilingual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I like how you have explored over the series of work the impact of data,
Mm.
like both the initial training data set and where to put it during the training process. So it all seems to be sufficiently well explored right now with multiple studies being done on that. I'd like to ask about a different aspect, which is the model
Mm.
itself, the
Yes.
model size.
Mm-hmm.
Because in this work, MR3,
Mm-hmm.
and I suspect in other works as well, you probably saw that effect that much smaller model can perform much better than the models of bigger sizes. So in MR3, for example, you surpassed the performance over the 9 times bigger GPT-OS 120 billion
Mm-hmm.
parameters model. Um, is can you can you elaborate on the design choices that make it possible, and in general about the relationship between the model size and multilingual capabilities?
Uh,
What have you learned about that?
yeah, so I think there's definitely pushback against using the giant models and benchmarking these gigantic models and just, paying a very large amount of fees to benchmark these multilingual, like these low resource data sets, and these data sets, these languages that have low resource in terms of data and low resource in terms of, financial capabilities and compute. So I think the idea of using smaller models is absolutely on par with this line of research versus using like a huge model, because many regions might not have the financial capabilities to fine tune billions and billions of parameters. With David Undergroha, we also published a paper called Proxy LM. So we started off, trying to predict the performance of low resource languages for different tasks without needing lots and lots of big models, right? Without using the big models. And that led to the work of trying to predict the performance using a proxy model. So instead of using the biggest model, we found that we were able to predict performance fairly well with a smaller model. Obviously not like a vanilla transformer or small 100. And so using that work, we were able to have insights that maybe we don't have to use giant models all the time. Sometimes we do want to use small models, and small LLMs are now becoming the way to go for resource scarce scenarios. And also, even if you have a lot of resource, you do not need to use the biggest model all the time. So we do have work that benchmark the performance prediction of using a proxy smaller model. And that came out in EMNLP 2024 findings. Yeah, so we were very excited to show that
What's
work. Proxy
what's the
LL,
name of
Proxy
proxy
LLM.
one?
Yeah, Proxy LLM. So it's about using a smaller model as a proxy, as a
Mhm.
stand-in for estimating a bigger model.
Amazing.
And in the language
Great.
context, so in a low resource language context. So I think all my work is the same as the NLP community, but in the specific context of considering low resource languages.
Maybe just for the audience, could you make it clear for everyone what do you mean by high resource language, medium resource language, and low resource language? What do those concepts involve?
So Joshi et al. In 2020 defined the low resource language. So we use it based on this meaning. So low resource languages is based on the scarcity of data, based on Joshi's definition. And Joshi defines it on um, the amount of unlabeled data and labeled data. So unlabeled for the pre-training and the label for the fine-tuning. Pre-training, so just, common crawl, scraped web data on the internet. And so 5 up here is your English with lots of internet unlabeled data and lots of label data. So label data like your sentiment analysis or your name entity recognition, you know, things that require human annotation. So all from 5 all the way down to 0. These clusters, 0 for incredibly low resource, not even any label data, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. So that's the definition of low resource language based on data. There's also other considerations, but when I talk about low resource, it's always going to be based on data. But other considerations includes, not having a lot of computational resource, not having a lot of tools and models, as well as other considerations from the anthropology and social science perspective, having a writing system, the number of linguistics experts to define even the language itself, the number of surviving speakers in the community are also in consideration. So we've written a foundational survey paper on low resource language specifically for translation. So for translation is the task of translating from one language to another. And you might imagine that most of the time one of these language pairs either the source or the target is English. So for our foundational paper, we categorize for the translation task. Medium resource is anything from 1 million to 500,000 based on like the 200 papers that we surveyed. 0.5 to 1 million is medium resource. 100,000 to 500,000, so 0.1 million to 0.5 million is low resource, and anything less than 100,000 sentences is considered extremely and low resource. Our follow-up paper to this, we actually found that 5,000 sentences are often enough for a translation task. And I think the following year after our paper, Meta won the best paper that says 10,000, like 5,000 is enough, but 1,000 is enough for a barely, like a very very low resource, barely resource sentence. It actually makes a difference for the data set.
Mhm. Right. And then again, a lot of your work is on the diverse set of lower resource languages.
Yes.
But there are several studies that are focusing specifically on very specific languages. I wonder what was your motivation to focus on that?
Yeah, okay. So I just want to clarify that I do work on um Taiwanese Hokkien, which is my mother tongue. So I do have several
Hmm.
works in that, but I have to say that the paper is not as highly cited because these Hokkien speakers, Taiwanese Hokkien speakers are only based in Taiwan.
Hmm.
But so they don't get as much visibility as the benchmark papers that includes like tens or 20 languages. So basically, the more languages
Makes
you
sense.
cover, the more highly cited the paper, like the more reach that paper would have. So my native tongue
Hmm.
is Taiwanese Hokkien, so not as much reach. We are collecting data sets on Chinese error translation. So it's like Comet, which identifies very fine grained errors in translation. So we're doing that for different Chinese dialects. We collect data sets for Mandarin, Cantonese, Wu Chinese, which is Shanghainese, and then and Taiwanese Hokkien, and we're hoping to cover more. It's sort of like a long-term project. We're hoping to add more and more Chinese dialect languages as we go. If it's
Hmm.
Hakka or Tai Sanghua or some indigenous languages in China and Taiwan, that would be really great.
Yeah. Also, speaking about that, you mentioned previously, and you also have findings that go back to this aspect in multiple studies. And I'm speaking now about machine translation
Mm.
to or from English.
Yeah,
When we speak about non-English
yeah.
languages, what is what's your take on this? What are the advantages and disadvantages of this approach of translating everything from English to non-English language, or using English as
The
a
pivot, the anchor.
as a pivot? Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So English is predominant. It is definitely the most strong, the highest resource, the language that we use, even in publishing research works. Um,
Mhm.
it sometimes it acts as a barrier of like who is included and who is not included in research communities or in the research. So um yes, so English is a pivot language. So you translate from your language. So there is works, there's papers that talk about that language models reason in English because it has seen all
Mhm.
the data in English, and it does not reason in other languages because it hasn't seen it. And so what you're doing is when you're translating everything into English, you're changing it into like a English context. And then when you're translating it out, a lot of times you lose the meaning. So I was just talking to an ethics professor in who teaches in Mandarin Chinese, and she said that they would translate it from Chinese to English back to Chinese in their I guess in their learning system, and the translations are very strange. And so we come to the problem. So I'm walking you through the process, but the soundbite, the key point is multi LMs and reasons in English, so it doesn't contain the other cultures and languages and ways of thinking and the ways of speaking. So you can imagine that when you translate from when you translate from your language to English, and then you feed it into a language model, like a foundational language model that everybody is feeding their thoughts and their work and their I guess like their business APIs into. This model only predominantly thinks in the English language and in the westernized context. So it doesn't encapsulate the cultural nuances, and it doesn't capture the values and the ethics of your language and your culture. So if you think about it, right, like maybe in like certain cultures they value, harmony and group dynamics, and sort of like the better. So in Asian cultures there's this idea of like, preserving, doing what's good for everyone, versus like maybe in the Western context, you really want to sell yourself and promote yourself. But when you feed it into the language model, it generates things now is now not capturing your context as well. Same thing with language, right? Like it could be a very straight dictionary translation. So, something that is translated as to walk might be translated to something that's like, to walk the land, or to walk the land by the rivers. Now, that doesn't, like, all that nuance, cultural nuances, the beauty of the language, the underlying meanings, that's all lost. And so it's similar, like when you're translating, it depends on what you translate to. Like, when you in Cantonese culture and in definitely like the Hokkien Taiwanese culture, when you say, have you eaten? So a common greeting, you don't say hello, how are you, or like how was your day, or how are things going, or like more informally, what's up. But the formal greeting when you talk to someone, when you call someone, is have you eaten? And from someone from the outside, it's like, have you eaten? Like, yes, I had breakfast like 5 minutes ago, and this is what I ate. But in these cultures, is it's an act of care, and it's and so when you call someone, it's like, have you eaten? Or like, any time of the day, the formal greeting is have you eaten? And that's sort of like conveying like, a sense of care, and like, the care of their well-being. So yes, so this is a very non-technical answer to a very technical question, right? You're asking me, should everything be translated to English? And the technical answer is yes. We have papers on that. In fact, we just resubmitted something. The journal process is very, very long. So we just resubmitted something that translated everything from that language, like Sinhala and Tamil, to English and back, and then only translated between Sinhala and Tamil, and sort of cutting out the English middle. So yes, we do have technical results on that. But on the other hand, there's also, now that with the cultural work and LLMs, there is a lot of meaning that is lost. That cultural meaning that is lost when you are translating everything into a dominant, just English, just just westernized dominant context, and you're sort of losing all the individual richness from every single language and every single culture when you're just doing it, feeding it through there.
Yeah, that's the awesome summary, I would say, of what we were speaking about in the previous episode with Vera Schwartz. I will link it to this
Oh,
video as
yes,
well.
Barrett.
But what I specifically like about what you said is that it almost sounds to me like if you just care about the numbers in the benchmarks and
Yes.
you want to achieve a higher score in the standard benchmark, then translate to English and back and have English as a pivot language. That's what technically makes it better. But if you care about
The
the
meaning.
actual meaning of what the model is doing, the actual cultural background knowledge and the meaning of that model is going to understand, then it's probably not the best way to move forward.
But I think the other problem is this information is not encoded digitally anywhere, right?
And then we are back to data, right?
So we're back to the issue, right? So we're back to the problem of like what is really the interaction between, and a senior, like a grandparent and a child, and that information being transmitted through of the culture, the traditions, your celebrations, that is missing when that child is only interacting with a language model. So, you know, I also worry about our education system, right? Like our students only writing their things with the help of a language model versus like maybe going out and actually talking to a human or to somebody who has that traditional knowledge.
Uh, do I get it correctly that you're worrying that that type of knowledge, cultural
Hmm.
knowledge, it's not possible to even
Capture.
capture that via language alone?
Yes. Oh, yes, for sure.
Okay.
So the things that you experience in your culture, the way of making a certain dish, the way of celebrating a certain festival, the way you talk about why a spiritual ritual, like why it's important to your family. That's very specific to your family and very specific to your culture. And even like, like I said, like some of the cultures are very like regional specific too. Like that is not, I don't think that is fully captured by a language model that's just generically scraping things from the internet.
Mhm.
And then, having like the dominant, like, most of the internet is English, right? Like how is it going to capture? And even if some historian or anthropologist go and curate that material, it's still like a small amount of material. So right now, no. How are we going to do it? I don't know. Ethically, should we do it? Lots of interesting research questions. It'll make a
Interesting.
really great thesis, thesis topic.
Yes, yes. For someone who is open to that, I would definitely recommend to consider that topic. It's really interesting whether
It's
and
intriguing.
to
Hmm.
what extent we can learn culture from language only. We
Right.
can to some
What
extent for sure because
capture?
English language models, English only language models show that
Hmm.
we can capture that to some extent, but
Hmm.
what is that extent
Yeah.
is another question.
Mm.
Okay, interesting. So let's shift to another slightly different but very relevant topic, which is
Great.
cross-lingual
Yes.
transfer, not
Yes.
just uh, English only, but cross-lingual transfer.
Hmm.
And the cross-lingual transfer has been a central promise of multilingual NLP,
Mm.
right? I would probably call that, maybe not everyone.
Hmm.
Uh, Based on your research,
Hmm.
how well you think that aspect of cross-lingual transfer has been fulfilled by now in
Uh,
NLP?
I don't think it's fulfilled at all. There's this idea of like the curse of multilinguality. I think there's this idea that do we want to represent, do we just want one model or one, for whatever, and one model that does everything, right? The one general model that does everything. It does all the languages, it does all the tasks, it does all the reasoning, like a one central model that does it all. Or there's the debate whether we want regional models, right? Like one model for Africa, one model for Indic languages, one model for European. So there's Eurobird that came out. There's there's, do we want one model for every region? Or do we want to go even more fine grained? Do we want a Hokkien model versus a African, like maybe like a Aramaic model versus, like a very specific language models. Um, you know, and there's also the mathematical idea is how much, because there's the idea that, embeddings from the model, they contain some sort of meaning, like some sort of semantic meaning, which is like some sort of ideas that these mathematical vectors capture. And then there's thoughts, so there's papers that says, every language sort of encapsulate the physical world similarly. So the vectors should be similar, even though the words are different. Like a dog is a dog, right? But I just said like walking in one language might mean very different in a different language. So we want to talk, yeah. So we also want to think about um yeah, so there's these thoughts that, the models um can be captured for different languages because we think about the physical world similarly. But then there's also these ideas that maybe the models eventually become saturated, and then you cannot add more languages into that model, or it cannot, or this model only thinks in English and it doesn't appropriately capture the nuances of other languages. Yeah, so some very, very interesting things. Yeah, so for sure we're still falling short. As I mentioned in SIP 200, we talk about um in SIP 200 we definitely talk about regional languages from Africa, South America are definitely falling short compared to, the dominant English and European languages.
Right. I also like that idea that you have mentioned, that uh, the idea of having the embedding as a representation of
The
some
physical world.
specific
Yeah.
if, aspects of physical
Yeah.
world. Yes,
Mhm.
and I think it's not. It relates. It is relevant to some extent to your aligned fees research,
Mhm.
which is not about embeddings but about the layers and freezing and
Yes, yes.
unfreezing
Yeah.
different layers
Mhm.
uh, to make the cross-lingual transfer possible. Can you speak a little bit about that and how you came up with this idea in the first place?
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of the cross-lingual transfer, this is so we collaborate with Felix Gashi from France. His PhD topic was on alignment, right? Aligning the model and how that could perform better for smaller models. So we stuck
Mhm.
to these smaller, XNLI and BERT models. Yeah. And so the along the lines, I think I've I think for a long time I always had this idea that different layers. So I did publish a paper in 2018. It was only on archive, but we look at the idea that, different layers of the neurons might focus on different tasks. So there's, yeah, so I think Bertology also finds this in that, maybe the lower layer neurons attribute to the semantics, and then the higher layer neurons might attribute to like maybe more of the task. So we only fine tune the higher the ultimate layer with the the last with the second last layer, ultimate and penultimate. So that idea was revisited here where we try to freeze different layers of the neuron. The lead author Steve Backles is now doing his master's on reinforcement learning. and now is starting his PhD on that. So the idea is that, we want to take a look at different layers and freezing them differently and see if a particular one could be more efficient, or could have some language knowledge in it. Because I guess in 2018 we only studied like tasks and different Semitic, like different units. But now we're looking at languages, and maybe we can also look at culture as well. But the idea is that so then we started freezing different layers because we have limited compute and we can't be freezing individual neurons. We didn't get as far on the LR front either because of computational limitations. But from studying freezing different layers, we did find that, the lower layers did work better for tasks, and especially for tasks like part of speech tagging, which is more like lower level, very much like a linguistic task. It worked really well. We had to work a lot harder to get inference, which is a higher level um, problem, like reasoning, inference, natural language understanding. We did have to work harder on that. And so we have a new AACL paper coming up where we mixed the languages, and it performs quite well for natural language inference as well as post tagging. In the original align freeze, it did not really work as well for inference, but now with adding more data based on language similarity, that actually does make a difference. Um, and
Right.
then and then we are actually looking at future work where we might look at like multilingual neurons, and also looking at looking at different ways of mixing the data, the different languages in the input data.
Hmm. Interesting. So, if to speak about layers,
Hmm.
uh, can you see any differences between multilingual and monolingual LLMs in terms of what do layers represent?
Oh,
Or is it quite different, or is it maybe even model
huh.
specific?
That is very interesting research. That's a very interesting question. We have not actually explored monolingual um monolingual models. Mostly we focus on smaller multilingual models, encoder-decoder
Mm.
models. But we have been running experiments for larger decoder-only models that are based on the English, like they're mostly trained on English language. And there's some preliminary results are interesting, but we haven't done like the linguistics analysis for that yet. So
Hmm.
I think that could be something that is an interesting line of inquiry.
Right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing some of your results in the future
Next year.
if you decide to go.
Next year.
Yeah, next year for sure. Um, uh, your experiments with the aligned trees
Hmm.
also revealed that languages that are using non-latent script
Mm,
are susceptible to some catastrophic forgetting during realignment.
hmm.
Uh, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Why non-latent scripts are that vulnerable in your opinion? And maybe you do some additional work on that as well.
So this is not only true from a line freeze. I think we can bring it back to Iroko Bench. We can bring it back to all the languages. When you move away from the dominant script, when you move away from the dominant language, the performance definitely degrades. And part of the reason could be because the neural architectures, right? Like there is tons of NLP tools and pre-processing that is very tailored to English and Latin scripts. Usually when I tell people about low resource language, I start off with a definition of what is considered low resources, low resource in data, but also and compute, but also low resource in terms of the available tools. So having your parsers, dependency parsers, having your taggers, or some of these languages don't even have appropriate linguistics experts to formally define it and formalize it. So for sure, for different languages and different scripts that starts to deviate away from English, there's it's less able to be captured because it's not cleaned properly, it's not parsed properly, there's all these issues related to it. We are currently working on some architectures to help include more languages and to help alleviate that. For African languages, we always come back to Aramaic because it is the single non-Latin script. Um, but we also, yeah, so I think what is fascinating here is that we did, use different strategies, taking from different models from the embedding inputs, and we Frankenstein together a bunch of different architectures to try and make it more robust to natural language inference and to work well for Aramaic, which is a different script. Yeah, so we are actively studying that. The work is ongoing. Hopefully, we'll have a paper out, and so that I can talk more about it in the future.
Okay, so it's time now to slowly wrap up our conversation, and I just wanted to ask you as one of the last questions. Um, Throughout your work, you have worked a lot on the diversity of multiple different languages and the cultures as well, and this whole work definitely contributes to linguistic and cultural inclusion
Mm,
in the community.
mm.
Um, what would you what advice would you give to other researchers that want to work on underrepresented languages? Uh, what would you like to for them to have in mind, like on top of their
So
head?
yeah, so I think in the current landscape, there is not a lot of industry money to be made on not work on working in non-English languages or non-dominant languages. So as you go down, there's less industry. As you go down into the rare languages, there is um, less industry interests or funding for like anything that's extremely low and extremely niched. So there's definitely some balance in that. I think one thing you also want to be delicate about, especially for me, I work collaboratively with a lot of interdisciplinaries, is that everyone is passionate about their language, and so there's different poles from different languages and different issues in different language communities. So you just want to be respectful and honoring and being inclusive and acceptable of their perspective. And I think as I mentioned in the past, it's always the best to start with your own language because you have that personal connection, you have that lived experience, is authentically, who you are. Um, so when I work on a particular language with students, I always encourage them to start with their own language. Even with myself, um, I have quite a few projects on Taiwanese Hokkien, which is my mother tongue language. And so then based on that learning and experience, I'm hoping to take what I learned and hope to in, you know, um train students to work on their own language as well. So yeah, so I think it's it's a very rewarding topic to work on. Um, for me personally, very fulfilling, and it really just is doing something that's beneficial, that's going to impact many people in the world. So that is what is exciting for me. And I've sort of listed some of the more soft skills, things that you need to watch out for. In terms of technicality, based on your background, somebody who is from social sciences can focus on something that's more, data collection, benchmarking, or applications. And then if someone who is more mathematical or more technical and deep learning, then they can focus on a lot of the architecturing and creating new models, small models. So there's definitely work to be done all through the broad spectrum of disciplines.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that advice. And also, thank you for actually working on this topic, even though it's maybe not necessarily that topic that's going to get the most of the hype in the nearest future. But I think it's one of those topics that is extremely important, and it's great to hear your approach on like inviting interdisciplinary research into the topic as well. It's not just for computer scientists. It's not just for social scientists. It's the area where everyone can
A
bring some
difference.
value, yeah, and make some difference. So, as we close, what do you hope people take away from this conversation? And also, is there anything that you wanted to talk about but I did not ask you?
Yes. Yeah, so this is, as I mentioned, multilinguality and multicultural lism in the technology. It's very, very exciting. To me, is trying to bring everybody to the table. I think when we're using these technologies is very neat, is very cool and exciting. But just think about, the millions of people who don't have access to this because they don't speak English, and also the small perturbations of harms or the being left out um, because of the outputs of these models too, right? Like they're input wise, they are unable to access the technology, but output wise, some of these models might be outputting, small incorrections that, you know, even though it's small, but there is billions of people in the world using the models, it adds up to a lot, right? Maybe, imagine like you're from a certain culture and maybe the model always outputs, this culture, there's always something that's a little bit negative, and in a different culture is always something a little bit positive. Little things add up to a lot. I guess these are things that people call like systemic, right? Systemic biases. When your foundation model is built in, all these systemic things gets built up. Yeah, so I think is very exciting. Language models is changing the world because everyone's using it. But let's think about, how it's affecting people who are marginalized in the fringes. So I'm even thinking like recently we've been talking about like the elderly, as well as, immigrant elderlies who are definitely have less access to public services or who are less able to access government information. So yeah, so if there's one yeah, so going forward there's lots of exciting things. And I hope that others are also excited to join in solving this big problem.
Amazing. And this has been such a thought-provoking conversation about the critical importance of multilinguality in AI systems and the cultural inclusion in the AI systems. Thank you so much for sharing your research and insights with us today.
Thank you so
Uh,
much for inviting me.
And thanks to our listeners as well for tuning into Women in AI Research. You can find more information about Anna's research and publications in the episode description. So check that out. And we'll see you in 3 weeks with another deep dive with the women researcher pushing the boundaries of AI.